Missing toddler walks out of woods after 11 days, but she wasn't alone. Her husband had warned her about rescuing the dog. He begged her not to do it, laying all the facts down to stop her from bringing it home. He went on about it, telling her repeatedly, pit bulls are known for their killing instinct and dangerous bite force. But she refused to listen to him. By the time the 11th day had started, she was standing by the window, crying. Could the dog have done this to their baby? This was one of the worst things to happen to Terry that month. Her firstborn child had an accident that left him in the hospital, and she was terrified. What was worse was that her lastborn was now missing. She stood by the window, staring at the dark clouds that crept over their neighborhood. Why was the universe out for her family? How could this be happening to them? She wondered how she could live when they were not allowed to. Terry Sheffield was a loving, easygoing mother with a big heart. She lived in West Virginia with her husband and their two amazing children, 8-year-old Matt and 2-year-old Aisling. Life seemed to be going perfectly for their family. Terry was a successful business owner after opening a bakery in their small town. She'd found it quite easy to balance her personal and professional life. Their home was on the outskirts of town. Their backyard had a stretch of woods that was both breathtaking and eerie all at the same time. It would be covered in thick, white snow during the winter, and in the fall, it would all turn orange. Terry's husband, Jim, was a teacher at a local high school. He worked hard, determined to give Terry and their children everything they wished. They always thought their lives would remain perfect until disaster struck. They had always discussed getting a family pet. They all agreed that a dog would fit their little family perfectly. Terry wanted one that could watch over their home, as it was the furthest in the community. Jim wanted a dog that could come with him on hikes in the woods. The kids wanted a dog that they could play with in the backyard. But none of them knew what they were getting themselves into. After making their decision, the family went to a rescue shelter to adopt a dog. At first, they wanted to go to a pet store, but on their way there, little Aisling saw the shelter and convinced her parents to go there instead. She'd begged them, and Terry's ears were ringing from her continuous screaming and shouting. After looking at the dogs, the little girl yelled, "Mommy, Mommy, doggy. I want that doggy." When Jim walked over to see which dog she was referring to, he paused. Terry should have known that this wouldn't end well. When the Sheffields entered the shelter, they hoped to find a good boy to take home. Unlike the pet store they'd wanted to go to, this place seemed extremely chaotic. Animals were all over the place, hollering, barking, hissing, and meowing. A shiver ran down Terry's back just from entering the place. She kept it together because her little girl had never been this excited to be somewhere before. She had no idea that this would lead to nothing but pain. They started going through the shelter, looking for a small and cute dog. But Aisling had other plans in mind. She'd found a pit bull in one of the kennels and started playing with it through the protective enclosure. As soon as Terry noticed their connection, she knew the dog was perfect for their family. But Jim did not agree with this choice. He was right to have his reservations about the dog. It is no secret that pit bulls are considered one of the most dangerous dog breeds in the world, especially when they haven't been trained correctly. These dogs are fast and agile and also strong and ferocious when agitated. They can easily take out chunks of flesh when they feel threatened. Jim would not have that in his house. Jim tried to explain this to his wife and daughter. He said that the pets at the shelter could have experienced gruesome events in their past home that would make them even more dangerous. His daughter wouldn't listen and started crying as she begged him to let them keep the dog. Terry wanted a dangerous-looking and intimidating pet that could protect their home. She explained this to her husband and used Aisling's newfound connection to the dog to defend her claim. He was forced to agree with their request. But soon, trouble came knocking. The first week with the dog, named Rocket by the Sheffields, was good enough. Rocket was quiet and reserved, following every command Jim and Terry gave him. He also loved the kids, who couldn't get enough of him. But it wasn't until the first weekend that everything went south. Jim and Terry were in their backyard enjoying the cool Saturday afternoon breeze when they heard a gut-wrenching scream. Terry sprung to her feet, adrenaline pumping through her system as she tore toward the source of the sound. It was Matt, who had gone to play around the block with some of his friends earlier. She found him curled on the sidewalk outside the gate, screaming, with his hands tight around his leg. But that was only the start of Terry's nightmare. Matt's leg was gushing crimson. Pieces hung loosely as he moved around on the ground. He went into shock just as his eyes connected with Terry's. It was like he'd been waiting for before finally giving in to the agony. His dad scooped him up with Terry still stunned. They called 911 and drove Matt, who had lost a lot of blood, to the emergency room. Terry thought the nightmare had stopped, but it was only beginning. The doctors worked on Matt for 2 hours before finally coming to Jim and Terry with their report. They explained that Matt had been attacked by something big and vicious. It had torn away at his leg. They stated that the only thing that allowed him to make it home was the fear and adrenaline churning through him. But that wasn't the worst thing. They explained that due to the heavy blood loss, the hospital would need to keep Matt put until they were sure he wouldn't have any complications. He was drifting in and out of sleep, so Jim and Terry couldn't go in to see him. When they asked what the doctors thought hurt their son like that, one of them answered, "A dog. Something big, maybe a pit bull." Jim and Terry drove back home in silence that day. Although she wasn't sure if Rocket harmed their baby boy, Terry couldn't help but feel guilty for bringing him home despite Jim's warnings. She tried to recall if there was any blood on the dog's fur when she and Jim carried Matt into the living room to apply first aid to his leg. But her mind was foggy. On the other hand, Jim wasn't quiet after the experience. He yelled throughout the journey, although never mentioning Rocket by name. It was clear that he wasn't a fan of the dog. Back home, the couple had left their youngest, Aisling, with her grandma, who was happy to watch over her and Rocket. When they got home, the first order of business was to uncover what had happened. Jim and Terry watched footage of the nanocams peppered all over the house to pinpoint Rocket's position during Matt's attack. Terry was relieved when they saw the pit bull curled next to Aisling, watching cartoons with her. But Jim wasn't satisfied. He continued combing through the footage even as Terry explained to little Aisling that Matt was in the hospital and wouldn't be back in a few days. If only she knew that things would go from bad to worse. The distraught parents called it a night and retired to bed, hoping that Sunday would bring happier tidings. But they woke up to their grandma frantically calling Aisling and Rocket. The 60-year-old woman sounded alarmed. Jim and Terry jumped out of bed to see what the commotion was about. But what they found made them sit down in terror. Aisling was missing. Her room was in disarray, with chewed and torn clothes strewn everywhere. Terry let out a desperate moan as Jim began looking around, calling out for their daughter. He searched everywhere for her, looking behind the bushes in the backyard, the basement, and the attic. But he phoned the authorities when the hour mark passed without any findings. 2 officers came by immediately and began searching the Sheffield home. They asked their grandma a few questions, ascertaining that she didn't know what was happening. After 2 hours of turning the house upside down and searching for Aisling, the police decided to call backup. One of the officers, a veteran, couldn't even understand what was happening. Terry was beyond worried as she remembered the hospital report about what hurt Matt. If Rocket truly tried to take one of his legs, what would he do to Aisling? The mom choked back a sob as she thought about this, praying to God to protect her daughter. She hoped that noon wouldn't come without the authorities finding Aisling. Aisling had always been scared of the dark. Although this is expected for many kids her age, hers was a bit concerning. She couldn't even be alone in the daytime. The little angel was also on the autistic spectrum, which meant she needed constant care. She was too sensitive to sounds and often wore noise-canceling ear muffs to tone down the chaos around her. Terry broke down just thinking about how scared she was now. Noon came, with the authorities making little progress. They discovered that Aisling left the house with her noise-canceling muffs. They stood in pairs discussing in hushed tones, promising Jim and Terry that they would find their daughter. They continued their search through the afternoon, making each hour a grueling nightmare for Terry, who was now simmering in self-blame. She hoped by nighttime, Aisling would be back. The night passed with the officers finding nothing to help them deduce the whereabouts of the 2-year-old and her pet pit bull. Word got around about the search by morning, and everyone in the neighborhood stepped in to help. They searched each corner of the area, even bringing K9s to help pick up a trail. What they would discover would double Terry's fear and agony. The K9 units were quick to pick up Aisling's scent. Everyone in the search party was more than delighted at this development. But their hopes came crashing when the trail led into the thick dark woods around the Sheffield home. Terry screamed when an officer informed her that Aisling had wandered into the trees the day before. But that wasn't all. The officer also told her that after several tests at the hospital, the doctors had ascertained what had attacked her firstborn. It was indeed a pit bull. But he assured her that his team would do everything possible to bring Aisling home. They set into the woods with everyone in tow, starting a search that would last 10 days. Terry stood numb in her bedroom window, tired of sobbing and whimpering through the night. Her firstborn was still in the hospital, and her second was missing. Terry remembered one of her conversations with Jim. Pit bulls are known for their killing instinct and dangerous bite force, he'd seethed. Could her dog really have done this to her baby? Terry's eyes were glued on the dark, massive hills that stretched out into the horizon when something odd emerged from the trees. The form of a little girl took shape before her eyes. It was Aisling. Terry didn't know if this was a hallucination or not. She'd been getting quite a few of those lately, given how little she slept. She raced down the stairs, finding Aisling and Rocket in the company of rescuers, covered in mud and twigs. Terry scooped them up, crying as she checked their bodies for injuries. Aisling was covered in ticks and scratches. But Rocket was another story altogether. He had several bite wounds on his body, each of which painted a vivid enough picture of what must have happened in those woods. Terry called Jim and the authorities, and they took Aisling to the hospital for checkups. On the road, Terry asked her daughter why she had left them. Aisling's answer left steaming cracks in her heart. "Rocket and I wanted to see Matt," the girl replied drowsily. Terry hugged her as fresh tears streamed down her face. "That's so sweet," she said. "But don't ever leave us again, sweetie." Aisling had cut through the woods and gotten lost. It was clear that Rocket had been watching over her all the while. The doctors found traces of no-nuts energy bars in the girl's system. They theorized that Rocket had been stealing candy bars from somewhere to feed her. But that wasn't all. The pit bull's body's deep bite marks matched those on Matt's leg. When the parents asked Aisling about what she'd seen in the woods, she only started trembling. Disclaimer: to protect the privacy of those depicted, some names, locations, and identifying characteristics have been changed and are products of the author's imagination. Any resemblances to actual events, places, or persons, living or dead, are entirely coincidental.